They lied to you about what a prophet looks like. They gave you a Disney Moses, soft jaw, thin nose, beige skin, British accent, but the Bible you swear you believe doesn't back that man up. Let's burn this from the top. An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. That's Exodus 2:19. Not a meme, not a hot take. Scripture. The daughters of Midian see a man. They don't say a Hebrew helped us. They don't say some foreigner helped us. They call him one thing, an Egyptian. Hold that, because church folk will dance, shout, and speak in tongues over every verse, except the ones that expose their paintings. If Moses looked like the Sunday school posters, nobody in the ancient world is confusing him for an Egyptian. You don't walk into Lagos and mistake a Swede for a Yoruba man. You don't go into Tokyo and point at a Nigerian and say, "Nice Japanese guy helped me." That's not how human eyes work. That's not how phenotype works. That's not how survival in the desert works. So ask yourself, what did Moses have on him that made strangers see Egyptian before they ever heard Hebrew? You already know the answer. You're just scared to say it out loud in front of the stained glass. Here's the part they never tell you. Egypt wasn't a fantasy Middle East theme park. Egypt was Kemet, land of the black, on African soil, ruled by African people, documented by neighboring nations as black, not kinda tan, not Mediterranean vibe, black. The Greeks who visited wrote about their dark skin, woolly hair, the art on the walls, brown to deep brown, tight curls, broad noses, full lips. You know that look. You see it every day in the hood, in the islands, on the continent. So when Midianite girls say, "An Egyptian man helped us," they're saying, "A black man stepped in," and that black man was Moses. Now watch the trick they told you. Yes, Moses grew up in Egypt. Yes, he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. Yes, he passed as Egyptian in the palace, but somehow he didn't look like the people he lived among. He was just a pale Hebrew boy, magically blending in with a black royal court. You ever seen a random white kid raised by a Nigerian family? You ever seen a blonde child sitting in a Sudanese village? You notice them from a distance. Instantly, your eyes do not negotiate. So how is Moses mistaken for Egyptian by strangers if his skin didn't match the local template? You can't fake melanin. You can fake an accent. You can fake clothes. You can fake culture. But you cannot fake what the sun does to your skin. At this point, somebody's getting nervous. Race is modern. Color didn't matter back then. Stop making it about skin. Listen closely. I'm not the one making it about skin. History did, that art did, that the text did. The moment those women looked at Moses and said Egyptian, they told you what box their brain put him in. Humans always noticed, who looks like us, who doesn't. That's older than racism, that's survival. And in that survival logic, Moses lands on the Egyptian side of the line. Not by passport, by appearance. Here's the darker truth. They didn't just repaint Moses, they repainted your mirror. Because if Moses is black, then the narrative shifts. The man who split the sea, black. The baby hidden in the Nile, black. The lawgiver whose face shone like fire, black. And suddenly, the people taught to see themselves as background characters realize they've been reading about family this whole time. You think empire is going to let that stand? Of course they bleached him. Of course they dragged him out of Africa, out of Kemet, out of the Nile sun, and sat him in Rome, in Paris, in Hollywood. If Moses is black, the whole Western religious art gallery collapses like a cheap set. Look at the pattern. Egypt, in Africa. Moses, mistaken for an Egyptian. Jesus, hid in Egypt to blend in as a child. Ask yourself, what kind of baby do you hide in a black land if you don't want him to stand out? They didn't run to Sweden. They didn't run to Greece. They ran to a place where the child Messiah could disappear in a crowd of African faces. You're told that story every Christmas. You just never follow the logic. But we're not here to hold hands and explore perspectives. We're here to call a lie a lie. The lie. Biblical figures were basically European. Maybe a little tan, but not like you. The truth, the Bible's geography, history, and plain text keep dragging you back to Africa, to brown and black bodies, to people who would get profiled in modern airports. When they say Egyptian, they're not thinking about a Frenchman with eyeliner. They're thinking about the people history recorded, dark, African, Nile bred. Moses fit that enough to be labeled on sight. You want to know why this matters? Because image is theology. If I make your prophets look like me, I make God look like me. If I make your Savior look like me, I make holiness look like my features. And then when I colonize you, I can say, see, even your God resembles your master. This is not about crayons. This is about control. If Moses is black, if Egypt is undeniably African, if the Hebrews can pass as Egyptians in the text, then the whole whitewashed spiritual hierarchy cracks. And once that cracks, other chains start to rattle. So here's where we're going in this series. We're not going to sit in vague representation talk. We're going to drag this thing into the light, verse by verse, source by source. We'll pull the receipts, what ancient writers said Egyptians looked like, how the Bible repeatedly puts Hebrews in African spaces without blinking, why colonial art flipped the script, how modern scholarship plays word games to dodge the obvious. We're going to show you how Moses, the Egyptian-looking man, became Moses, the European prophet, and what that theft did to your mind. This is part one. The hook, the match to the fuse. You don't have to agree yet, but you will have to choose your childhood paintings or your own eyes reading the text. Because Exodus 2:19 is still sitting there, unbothered by your feelings. An Egyptian delivered us, not a Swede, not a Brit, not a Hallmark card Hebrew, an African. Next, we're going to walk straight into Kemet, into the art, the bones, the eyewitnesses, and ask a simple, dangerous question. If Moses looked like an Egyptian, what did Egyptians really look like, and why did they work so hard to make sure you never asked? They didn't just rewrite the story. They repainted the faces. Let's start with the obvious crime scene, Kemet, ancient Egypt, the same Egypt where Moses passed as a local, not a foreigner, not exotic, not different. Local. Exodus 2:19 is short but lethal. The Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. They saw Moses, they clocked him as Egyptian, no hesitation, no question mark. So here's the uncomfortable question. If Moses could be mistaken for an Egyptian, what did an Egyptian actually look like? Not the Hollywood version, not the kids' Bible cartoon, not the museum gift shop postcard, the real thing. Let's walk into Kemet like detectives, not worshippers of Western scholarship. First stop, the walls. The ancients didn't leave selfies. They left temples, tombs, murals, color-coded truth. Go pull up any honest image from the tombs of the nobles, from Thebes, from Saqqara, from the Old and Middle Kingdoms. You'll see 4 basic color codes the Egyptians used for people. Egyptians, reddish brown to dark brown skin. Nubians, darker brown to almost black. Asiatics, Levant, pale brown, yellowish tones. Libyans, lighter, more pale, sometimes with tattoos. Now lock that in. The Egyptians painted themselves closer to Nubians than to the pale Asiatics. They grouped themselves visually with Africans, not with Europeans, not with Levantine Semites. So when the Bible says Moses was mistaken for an Egyptian, it's saying he visually matched that palette, that category, that people. You don't confuse a blonde Swede for a Maasai warrior. You don't confuse a Korean for a Nigerian. You don't confuse a pale Levantine for a dark, reddish-brown African, unless they look the same. Now here's where it gets dark. You were never supposed to ask, why did they think Moses was Egyptian? You were trained to reverse engineer the answer. Egyptians must have been light, so Moses must have been light, so Hebrews must have been light, so the whole story stays safely European. That's not scholarship, that's psychological damage control. They didn't start from the text, they started from the desired image: white Moses, white Pharaoh, white Jesus, white disciples, and then they worked backward, cherry-picked skulls, ignored skin tones on walls, and rewrote entire regions as Middle Eastern, like that phrase erases Africa. Let's strip that illusion. Ancient Egypt was in Africa, not metaphorically, geographically, physically, genetically. The Nile doesn't ask for your opinion. It runs from deep in Black Africa straight through Kemet. The earliest dynasties, their art, their statues, their mummies, show broad noses, full lips, tightly curled hair, features you'd call black today if you saw them on the street. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land, not just for the soil. Look at how they represented themselves. Look at how they contrasted themselves with others. When they painted Libyans and Asiatics, they made sure you could tell them apart. Different clothes, different hair, different skin tones. But Moses walks into Midian. They see him. They say, an Egyptian helped us. That's not just a stray detail. That's a visual match. Now let's add another witness. The Greeks. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, goes to Egypt centuries before Christ. He doesn't have Hollywood in his head. He doesn't have Sunday school coloring books. He looks at Egyptians and writes, they are Melanchthros and Ulatriches, dark-skinned, woolly-haired. That's not a Nordic description. That's not a Mediterranean tan. That's a black profile. Later, other Greek writers compare Egyptians and Ethiopians as close kin in appearance. Same region, same features, same African template. So when the Bible says Moses looked Egyptian, it's not saying he looked like a lightly tanned Italian on vacation. It's saying he fit the description of a dark-skinned, woolly-haired African. Now watch the psychological trick. They know if you accept that Egyptians were black Africans and Moses could pass as one, then you have to admit that early Hebrews weren't looking like modern European Jews or modern American evangelicals. You'd have to admit that the spiritual foundation of the West was laid by people who look like those they enslaved, lynched, segregated, and mocked. That's not just inconvenient, that's explosive. So what do you do when the evidence points one way, but your power structure points another? You don't argue the evidence. You smother it. You normalize the lie. You flood movies, textbooks, church art with pale Egyptians and eyeliner, olive-skinned Hebrews with soft curls, and a Jesus who looks like he grew up in Norway. You condition the eyes of the child before the mind ever asks a question. That's dark psychology 101. Control the image. You control the memory, you control the identity. So by the time someone reads Exodus 2:19, their brain doesn't even flinch. An Egyptian helped us. Of course they think Egyptians are just kind of brown, Hebrews are kind of brown, everybody's kind of beige. No big deal. But if you reset the image to what the ancients actually recorded, Egyptians as dark African people, then Exodus 2:19 becomes a grenade, because now it reads like this: a black African-looking man helped us, and they assumed he was Egyptian. That means Moses didn't just share geography, he shared phenotype. Now let's push deeper. Moses grows up in Pharaoh's house, adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, raised as a prince of Kemet. You think this royal family, obsessed with bloodlines, order, and hierarchy, would raise a visibly foreign child who looked nothing like them, and no one would notice. Ancient courts were paranoid. They watched lineage like hawks. If Moses looked wildly different, he would have been marked, mocked, or murdered. Instead, he passes, he walks like them, dresses like them, looks like them. He flees Egypt, lands in Midian, and strangers still say Egyptian. That's visual confirmation from two different environments. Egypt didn't see him as foreign. Midian didn't see him as foreign. Only your modern programming sees him as not black. Now here's the sinister layer. Why did they work so hard to keep you from connecting these dots? Because if Moses is black, Egypt is black. early Hebrews are Afro-Asiatic, then the whole Eurocentric religious fantasy starts to crack. If the people God spoke to, freed, covenanted with, and walked with were black and brown, then the idea that whiteness equals chosen, civilized, or closer to God dies on the spot. Supremacy needs holy imagery. It needs a white Moses standing before a white Pharaoh, worshiping a white Jesus. It needs your subconscious to associate divinity with a certain face. So they didn't just change the theology, they changed the art, the casting, the color grading of history. They didn't care what the Bible actually implied. They cared what your mind instinctively pictured when you heard the word prophet. Moses couldn't be allowed to look like the people in the ghettos, on the plantations and the projects. So they performed surgery on the story, quietly, relentlessly. But the text is stubborn. The art is stubborn. The bones are stubborn. They keep whispering the same thing. Moses looked like an Egyptian. Egyptians were African. Do the math. Next, we're going to drag this further. If Moses blended with black Kemet, what does that say about the rest of Israel? About Joseph, who also passed as Egyptian? About Jesus, who hid in Egypt as a child without attracting a lynch mob? We're about to put the whole cast back in their original skin, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee how hard they fought to blind you. Moses didn't just look Egyptian, he passed as Egyptian, to the point that foreign women at a well said, "An Egyptian delivered us," Exodus 2:19. They weren't guessing his passport, they were clocking his face, his skin, his aesthetics. And so let's stop playing games. If Moses walked up and the first thing they saw was a pale, sunburnt, pink-skinned man, you really think they'd say, yeah, that's definitely an Egyptian? No, they'd say, who's this northern stranger? Who's this outsider? Who's this man who clearly doesn't belong? But they didn't. They said, an Egyptian, because in their world, Egyptian meant something very specific, African, brown to black, Nile-bred, sun-baked, not a Renaissance painting, not a Catholic postcard, not that soft beige Jesus they hang in your grandma's living room. Let's drag this into the light. Moses wasn't raised among Egyptians. He blended with Egyptians. This is where it gets interesting. Moses wasn't born in Pharaoh's palace. He was born under a death order. Hebrew, Levi tribe, illegal male baby. His mother hid him, then floated him down a river. He was adopted into the royal house. So pause. If Hebrews were some totally different looking people, how did a Hebrew baby get raised in the palace and nobody ever say, why does this child look nothing like us? Pharaoh's daughter saw him, felt sorry for him, took him in, named him, raised him as her own. That only works if this baby could visually pass, if he looked like he could be one of them. You don't smuggle a Scandinavian baby into a Yoruba palace and nobody notices. You don't slip a Chinese baby into a Viking longhouse and everyone just shrugs. But here, Hebrew child, Egyptian palace, no visual scandal. Why? Because the Hebrews in Egypt looked like the Egyptians in Egypt. Same region, same sun, same phenotypes, different tribes, same continent. The Bible doesn't say, and the Egyptians were shocked at how foreign he looked. It says he was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's deep integration. And when he fled Egypt and landed in Midian, strangers saw him and said, an Egyptian delivered us, not a Hebrew, not some foreigner, not a man from the north, an Egyptian, because that's what he looked like. Someone lied to you in crayon. Let's talk about what they did to your mind. They took Africa and split it in your head. They let you keep black Africa at the bottom, tribes, drums, poverty. They painted it primitive. Then they took Kemet, Egypt, and quietly lifted it out of Africa in your imagination. Same continent, same river, same landmass. But in your school books, Egypt floats in a racial no man's land. Not quite black, not quite white, just ancient people. The vague tan, ambiguous beige. Convenient, isn't it? Because if they let you connect the dots, that the pyramids, mathematics, medicine, astronomy were all African achievements built by people who looked like the ones they taught you to call slave stock, the whole racial hierarchy starts to look ridiculous. So they whitened the top, darkened the bottom, and left you confused in the middle. And Moses? They turned him into a white man raised by almost white Egyptians who still somehow live in Africa, but aren't really African when it counts. That's not history. That's psychological warfare.
True. If Moses wasn't black, the story makes no sense. Run the logic. 1. He grew up in Pharaoh's house. He moved like royalty, ate like them, dressed like them, learned like them, but more importantly, he looked like them enough to be convincing as their son. 2. He killed an Egyptian and fled. He went into exile. No royal clothes, no entourage, just a man on the run. 3. He shows up in Midian. Foreign land, different people, new environment. The women at the well are not Egyptian. They don't owe him anything. They don't need to flatter him. They just look at him, and their brain says Egyptian. That's raw visual recognition. You know how this works. You see a man with certain features, certain hair, certain melanin, and your brain goes Ethiopian, Somali, Nigerian, Sudanese. Even if you're wrong, you're basing it on how they look. That's what's happening in Exodus 2:19. They weren't reading his documents, they were reading his face. So if Moses had been light-skinned, straight-haired, northern-featured, in a world where Egyptian meant dark, Nile African, you think that's the label they'd pick? But they would have said a stranger, a foreigner, some man from another land. But they didn't. They said an Egyptian, because Moses wore Egypt on his skin. The Bible keeps hinting. You were trained not to see it. Notice something. The Bible never wastes words, but it also rarely stops to explain
obvious visual truths to its original audience. It doesn't say like Egyptians were black, because to the people reading at the time, that was obvious. It's like saying today, by the way, snow is cold. You only have to explain what people have been trained to forget. So the text just casually drops clues that explode in your face once you strip off the European filter. Joseph passes as Egyptian. His brothers don't recognize him in Egypt. Hebrews and Egyptians can be visually confused. Jesus hides in Egypt without sparking a racial riot. Moses is mistaken for an Egyptian at first glance. All of that only works if Egypt is African, and the people in these stories look like they belong in Africa, not as tourists, not as missionaries, as natives. The real crime wasn't just recoloring Moses, it was recoloring your imagination. They didn't just repaint the prophets, they repainted your sense of possibility. If Moses is white, if Egypt is vaguely Mediterranean, if Jesus is European, then power, intelligence, and divinity slowly migrate north in your mind. Africa becomes the background, not the architect. So when you read Moses the lawgiver, you don't picture a dark-skinned African man walking into Pharaoh's court with the confidence of a prince and the rage of an oppressed people. You picture a movie still. Blue eyes, brown wig, British accent. That's not just inaccurate, it's theft. They stole the visual of your ancestors and replaced it with a costume. And then they use that costume to preach to you, judge you, colonize you, and tell you you were never in the story except as a slave or a curse. But the text disagrees. The text says, Moses walked into Midian and was clocked as Egyptian. And Egypt was African, not metaphorically, geographically, historically, anthropologically. You don't have to like it. you just have to stop lying about it. We're not done. Because if Moses was black and Egypt was African, and Jesus could hide there without standing out, then the whole biblical world starts sliding back down into the continent they tried to lift it out of. Next, we're going to walk you through how they surgically separated Bible land from black land in your mind, and why the people who did it weren't just racist, they were strategic. This wasn't ignorance, it was design. And once you see the design, you'll understand why a black Moses isn't just a detail, it's a threat. They didn't just hide Moses' color, they hid his camouflage, because that's what it was, camouflage, Exodus 2:19. The daughters of Midian say, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. They didn't say, a Hebrew man helped us. They didn't say, some random foreigner. They said, Egyptian. Why? Because that's what he looked like. Not spiritually, not symbolically, visually, face, skin, hair, features. You only confuse someone for an Egyptian if he looks like the Egyptians. And the Egyptians were African, not spiritual Africa, not metaphorical Africa, geographical, anthropological, visual, black. So now you have a problem, because the story you were given is this. Moses, a pale man, raised in a brown land by a black kingdom who somehow gets mistaken for one of them. That's not theology, that's propaganda. Let's strip it down. Moses is born a Hebrew. Hebrews are living in Egypt. Egypt is an African superpower. Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby floating in the Nile. Now pause. What kind of baby can you hide in a black royal house and not trigger questions? You can't slip a Scandinavian baby into an African palace and pretend he's local. You can't raise a Nordic-looking child in a black court and then act shocked when everyone starts whispering. Why he look like that? Who's his real mama? Where he come from? Palace gossip would have destroyed the story before it even started, but scripture is silent on that kind of drama. Why? Because Moses didn't stand out visually. His difference wasn't on his skin, his difference was on his destiny. He blended. That's the part they don't want you to see. Because if Moses blended in Egypt, and Egypt was black, then Moses was visually compatible with blackness. Not a tourist, not a visitor, not a white guy in a foreign land. He was close enough to be called Egyptian by strangers who had no reason to flatter him. Those Midianite women weren't writing theology. They weren't trying to be woke. They just saw a man and named what he looked like. An Egyptian delivered us. You can't spin that away without lying to yourself. Now here's where it gets darker. Whitewashed religion doesn't just repaint Moses. It rewrites your subconscious. If you can convince a global population that Egypt was Mediterranean tan, Hebrews were light olive, everyone important was basically white adjacent, then you shift the center of the story away from Africa and toward Europe without saying it out loud. No decree, no announcement, just image after image, movie after movie, children's Bible after children's Bible, and the brain learns quietly, obediently. So when you read Moses was mistaken for an Egyptian, your mind supplies a safe, sanitized picture. Not Nubian, not Cushite, not deep melanin, just a nice, beige, digestible man who can fit on a church wall without making anyone uncomfortable. That's not an accident. That's design. Because a black Moses does something dangerous to the psyche of this world. It puts blackness at the center of liberation, at the center of law, at the center of revelation. Not as a side character, not as a servant, not as a background extra, as the man who stares down empire and wins. Now imagine you're building a system that feeds on black bodies, but wants black souls to feel small. You can't let them see themselves as the face of deliverance. You can't let them look in the mirror and line up their features with the man who split the sea. So what do? You don't delete Moses, you Erskine him, You keep the story, you change the face, you keep the miracles, you change the melanin, you keep the power, you move it one shade lighter, then another and another, until the subconscious no longer associates chosen prophet, lawgiver with blackness. That's not ignorance. That's psychological warfare. Because if Moses looks like you and you are black, something awakens. You stop seeing yourself as the one always needing rescue. You start seeing yourself as the one God uses to do the rescuing. That shift is deadly to a system built on your submission. So they had to come for the image. Look at the pattern. Moses, mistaken for Egyptian. Joseph married into Egyptian power. His brothers don't spot him immediately. Abraham passes his wife off as his sister in Egypt because she's desirable to Egyptians. Hebrews live among Africans for generations. You don't get that level of blending if everyone looks wildly different. You don't pass as local if your face screams foreign everywhere you go. The Bible gives you hints. The art world erases them. And here's the twist. You were trained to defend the erasure. So when someone says Moses was black, the first thing that rises in you might not be curiosity. It might be resistance. Does it matter? Skin color isn't the point. God looks at the heart. You know who taught you that reflex? The same machinery that painted him wrong. Because if it truly didn't matter, they wouldn't have changed it. If it truly didn't matter, they wouldn't fight so hard to keep white Moses on every wall, in every film, on every page. They know it matters. That's why they lied. Now, come back to that scene in Midian. Moses flees Egypt. He's a wanted man. He sits by a well. Some women show up. Shepherds harass them. Moses steps in, drives them off, helps them water their flock. They go home. Their father asks, "How is it that you've come so soon today?" They answer, "An Egyptian delivered us." Delivered. You catch that word? The first time Moses is called deliverer is not by Hebrews, not by scholars, not by priests, by strangers who see an African-looking man use his strength to break oppression at a well. The visual and the vocation are tied together. Egyptian, deliverer, blackness, liberation. Now imagine you're a black child. Reading that with true images in front of you, you see Moses with skin like your uncle, nose like your father, hair like your cousin. You hear, "An Egyptian delivered us." And something in your chest says, "So that's what we do. We deliver." That's the threat. Because a people who see themselves as deliverers are harder to chain. A people who see their features in the face of prophets are harder to shame. A people who recognize their reflection in the heroes of sacred history are harder to control. So the system did what systems do when they feel a threat. It edited the story until the threat looked harmless, until Moses looked like the sons of the empire instead of the sons of Africa, until the staff in his hand felt like a symbol of European power instead of African defiance. But the text is still there. Whispering, leaking truth. An Egyptian delivered us. The Bible didn't hide it. Religion did. And once you see that, you stop arguing about race and start asking a sharper question. Who benefits from a world where Moses is not allowed to look like you? Because the answer to that will tell you who's been writing your pictures and what else they've been hiding. We're not done. Because if Moses looked black and Egypt was black, you have to ask, who else have they repainted? And why does every brushstroke seem to move in the same direction? They didn't just repaint Moses, they repainted you. That's the part that burns, because this isn't just about a man in sandals and a staff. It's about a whole people, a whole bloodline, airbrushed out of their own story. Let's finish this. Moses looked Egyptian. Egyptians were African. Nobody in that story was confused. The only people confused are the ones raised on children's Bibles and Hollywood casting calls. Exodus 2:19. The daughters of Midian run home and say, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds." They didn't say a Hebrew, didn't say a foreigner, didn't say some random guy. They said an Egyptian, meaning he looked like them, moved like them, matched the visual profile. You don't mistake a blonde Roman for a Nubian. You don't confuse a pale Greek with a dark Cushite. But Moses instantly read as Egyptian, and this is after he'd been living in Pharaoh's house, raised as a prince, dressed like them, groomed like them, moved in their circles. If he didn't fit visually, they'd have called him out as foreign. They didn't. Why? Because the man matched the land. So let's stack it. Ancient Egypt, Northeast Africa, not Europe, not the Middle East as drawn in textbooks. Africa. The Nile doesn't care about modern politics. It runs through black soil, feeds black kingdoms, built black dynasties. Look at the oldest statues, the noses, the lips, the skin paint, the hair. That's not Scandinavia, that's not Paris, that's not Rome, that's melanin, that's sun, that's Africa. They can argue all day in conferences, but the stone doesn't lie. So now here comes Moses, born of Hebrews, raised in black Egypt, mistaken for Egyptian. If he was some pale, sandy-haired, blue-eyed man, those Midianite girls would have said, "A strange foreigner helped us." They didn't. The Bible doesn't. It calls him what he looked like, Egyptian. And here's the part they really don't like. He marries into Midian, another Semitic people of the region. Desert folk, brown folk, not Nordic. And nobody in that narrative treats his appearance as unusual. No one says, "Why is this light-skinned man so far from home?" No one stares, no one questions. He blends into the Afro-Asiatic world he's in because he belongs to it. So why does this matter? Because if Moses was black and Egypt was black and the Hebrews lived in and around black spaces, then the entire mental picture fed to the modern world is a lie with a purpose. A soft, smiling Sunday school kind of lie, but still a lie. They didn't just lighten Moses, they lightened the whole stage, the extras, the crowd, the background. They drained the melanin from the story until the Bible looked like Europe with sand. Because if the book is black, if the prophets are black, if the chosen line runs through black faces, then the lie that God doesn't look like you starts to crack. And when that cracks, control starts to slip. This is not about hating anyone. This is about theft. Cultural theft, spiritual theft, ancestral theft. When you repaint Moses, you're not just editing art. You're editing identity. You're telling black children, holiness doesn't look like you. Prophets don't look like you. Leaders chosen by God are from somewhere else. Somewhere lighter, somewhere whiter. So they grow up seeing God's story through someone else's face. They pray to a face that doesn't resemble their father. They worship images that don't resemble their mother. And then you wonder why inferiority runs so deep it feels like personality. Let's be surgical. If Moses was black, then Pharaoh was black. The royal court was black. The palace servants were black. The soldiers who chased Israel to the Red Sea were black. The world of Joseph, who rose to power in Egypt, black. The world that Abraham moved through when he went down to Egypt, black. These aren't side notes. These are core scenes of the Bible. You change the faces, you change the power dynamic in the reader's mind. And that's exactly what happened. Not direct. Take a step back. Everywhere you look, bleached saints, bleached prophets, bleached Christ, the same brush, the same direction. It's not an accident, it's a program. Because if you can convince the world that holiness is white, leadership is white, divinity is white, then whiteness becomes sacred by association. And everything else, everything darker, becomes other, becomes less, becomes suspect. That's not theology, that's propaganda. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Whiteness needed a holy origin story. So it hijacked one. It climbed into the Bible, put on the robes, and said, "This has always been my role." But the geography rebels. The archaeology rebels, the DNA rebels, the text itself rebels. Because the land was African, the climate was African, the kingdoms were African, and Moses looked like Egypt, which means Moses looked like Africa. So what happens when you finally say this out loud? When a black child hears Moses looked like you? When a black man hears the man who stood before Pharaoh, who split the sea, who spoke with God face to face, had your skin tone, your features, your lineage? When a black woman hears the women who hid him, raised him, saved him, and defied a king looked like your aunties, your grandmother, your reflection, something shifts quietly, violently, beautifully. The Bible stops being a foreign film with subtitles. It becomes family history. And that's what they're afraid of, because if you realize this is your story, you stop approaching it like a guest. You stop asking permission to belong. You stop waiting for someone else to explain your own inheritance. You start reading with a different spine, a different pride, a different expectation. You start seeing yourself not as background people, but as central figures in the human story. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. They will say it doesn't matter what color Moses was. Funny, it mattered enough to change it. It mattered enough to build an entire visual empire on the lie. It mattered enough to carve false faces into stone, to print false faces into Bibles, to project false faces into movies. It mattered then, so it matters now, not to worship color, but to bury lies, not to replace one supremacy with another, but to tell the truth, even when it burns, especially when it burns. So here we are. Moses looked Egyptian. Egypt was African. The math is not complicated. The only reason this feels radical is because the lie was total. They didn't just repaint Moses, they repainted memory. But memory is fighting back. The stones are speaking, and the text is speaking. Your blood is speaking. And underneath centuries of white paint, the original image is still there. Dark, royal, unapologetic. So when they ask you, why are you making it about race? Tell them, I'm not making it about race. You did when you erased one.